Yeah, so this recording is going to be a memorandum of a slew of suggestions and advice that I would suggest to the DA. Obviously, I don't know too much about the actual behind the scenes. Well, actually, I know a fair bit, but my knowledge is not comprehensive, so you have to sort of take this with a grain of salt. But anyway, it should at least be some interesting ideological and rhetorical sort of things to consider. Um, it's wonderful that the DA has gotten rid of Musi Maimane because, you know, I don't think the party was ever going to gain black voters by merely trying to sell itself as a more credible version of the ANC, in terms of policy. I think that's, it's sort of because I think people don't actually realize the extent to which the identity consciousness culture is toxic, and people can sort of feel the fundamental kind of that it's a different world, that it's a different cultural paradigm, and that it's basically like rehashed apartheid. It really does destroy any kind of common morality. It changes everything into the lens of identity. It's very corrosive in so many ways. Um, what can I say more about this point? And I think people have a sense of how it gums up, how just everything functions. There are these things that are spoken about, imposter syndrome. Well, the real cause of imposter syndrome is this kind of the promotion of identity through tokenism and the kind of as a representative compensation that people receive special dispensations on behalf of their whole race as a proxy for being uh, uplifted. It's so disgusting in so many ways. It also does havoc to the actual integrity and structure of the Constitution, which has already gone out the window, sadly. So, how to broach these things in terms of politics, because they do actually need to be stated in some sense, but other things probably need to be stated first. I think the way that the DA needs to go about actually gaining ground is that it must it must focus its message on the poor, and in making a convincing argument towards the poor, it will gain the support of middle class people in the same way that there's a section of the middle class that votes for Labour, or at least in terms of the old paradigm before everything got crazy from identity consciousness, and the kind of the hysterical sort of strange form of politics that creates this groupthink, which is really another reflection of the identity consciousness mob. Uh, Specifically how that fucks everything up, identity consciousness, is that people are really expecting culture to objectify them. People are demanding that they live in a culture that objectifies them based on their racial categorization or whatever. And obviously, it doesn't ever work. It's completely untenable because that objectification is judged according to how well it actually fixes the problems that it's supposed to, the injustices that it's supposed to solve, and obviously it can't. And itself objectifying people is itself a dehumanizing thing, but they demand a particular form of objectification that has all these requirements which are just impossible to satisfy. And through the actual process of objectification, which we now have in the form of policy, using race as a proxy for ameliorating disadvantage and all these things. I saw this very well written article by the Daily Maverick that sort of was ranting about the DA. And then it sort of at the end it said, well, Musi Maimane can go make a party for the black middle class or something like that, which at the end, which I thought was actually quite disjointed from the rest of the arguments in the article, which were, it was attending to some of these issues quite well. I think it was exploring them and going into them, but it's absolutely crazy. Like, so the idea is that Musi Maimane would essentially keep the government mandated black economic empowerment, but their black economic empowerment would just be like cleaner than the ANC's sort of slash and burn, kind of cannibalism and redistribution of everything. It would be sort of more controlled or something like that, and that they would be selling the same toolkit, but with the sort of uh, the spin that it would be more responsible in terms of keeping all the plate spinning, or that they would be able to juggle it better. It's sort of, I mean, it's really hopeless. I mean, the kind of, okay, so let's just take that as true. If Musi Maimane is going to go make a party to promote one South Africa for all by sort of trying to get support from the black middle class, well, this is how you counter it. You don't directly. I mean, you can also pick up middle class voters, essentially, because your plan essentially is so sort of maximizing in terms of its efficacy, and it's not sort of and it is correctly socially responsible. And so when I say focus on the poor, obviously the thing is that as soon as you have mandates and you have these quotas and things like that, there isn't enough to go around, and it doesn't ever assist the poor people. Essentially, it only assists people that already have access, that were very close to achieving the thing already, and then they just get their leg up from the regulation, and then because of that regulation, there's no growth in the economy, and the people who are hit the hardest are the people who just don't have a job. So it's wonderful to have all these high standards and these high wages for the people that do have jobs, but it's devastating for people that are excluded. And because we're not able to sort of be a developing economy and develop the ladder, essentially it's a weird sort of spiral in which the so-called welfare rhetoric, just keeps on seeming like, oh yeah, we just need more of that, which is, we're already sort of, that's completely unsustainable. We can't afford it anyway. So, if capitalism is going to get the brunt of the blame, ideological blame, as it always does by these, very toxic identity consciousness people, then how about we actually try capitalism out? How about we take Barack Obama's advice? We listen to the speech that he gave to us. So I think that if if the DA targets the message of growth as the means to development, and liberating the economy to be able to actually function without the red tape and the racial arithmetic of quotas and things like that, then we can actually see how not racist people are. Because then when people actually get appointments, or they get employment, it can't be because of the government mandate. It's because it's organic, it's fluid, it has real integrity. People don't have to trust that their job essentially was handed to them based on some government policy, and which is fundamentally unsustainable, which means that the whole thing is going to go bust anyway, when the whole, when the country has to go to the IMF and ask for essentially something, so that we can continue on the charade to delay, the sort of the white genocide that the EFF will be calling for as they blame everything on white monopoly capital. So and then it does get sort of more sophisticated. So, I mean, in some sense, this, I think, is actually quite liberating to a lot of the black middle class, this message that you're going to sort of take away these things. Because then, in some sense, the imposter syndrome goes away, it just evaporates. Because it won't, like, they're actually voting, essentially, if they vote for the DA, they're voting for this idea that they live in an authentic economy. They live in an authentic society in which they are not given this piece of the pie that's mandated by the government, but they actually own it. It belongs to them. They actually function within it organically. It's not this artificial imposition. And we start having a sustainable society that is actually jointly, that has people networking freely, coordinating with one another, and having a labor market that doesn't have this very toxic labor, these mechanics of a premium on, sort of on black labor because of the headhunting that goes on, and there's no more this sort of this artificial perverse incentive for people not to employ black professionals or black people that you might give expertise to or experience to, because then they'll just leave you 2 years later because their prospects are calibrated according to this weird thing. And so we never actually develop the ladder. We never actually grow the small and medium enterprises, which are actually the only thing that raises the floor to wages. Instead of imposing this artificially high wage, which means that so many of the population just will not be employed. Because that is actually authentically how you increase wages, is that you increase productivity, which means that you really have to have a developing economy, and that at some point there's a competition for labor. But, we never get to that if we don't actually have a ladder. What was the other thing about that is, because when you're not a big company and you don't have positions in your company that are very regimented and mechanical or something like that, when you're in a small and medium business, you want to retain your staff. There's a huge incentive not to have staff turnover when you're a small business. Because people's roles are quite specialized and they do a lot of different things that they learn how to do for that business, essentially. And so generally in small and medium businesses is where wages are much higher than the kind of the market labor pool or whatever. And if you have enough of them, it actually raises the floor of what you can expect, because people don't just have to go into this corporate rat race, they actually have an alternative, essentially. They don't just have to have these sort of, you have that degree and you have that thing. There's another market of real skills and people networking, but we've destroyed the networking because of the racial politics, and having to have these racial arithmetics when it's hard enough just to get the right amount of people with the right skills together to make a business plan. I mean, it would have been great if this had been the actual course, 10 years ago, but the ANC essentially has been very keen to set up a sabotaged economy so that they can have this political whipping boy, so they can get away with their disgusting corruption, which is facilitated as well by the identity consciousness. because all the actual laws that have been abused, or even if they weren't abused, it still creates this toxic morality. Now, in some sense, this is just on the level of generalization and objectification. In some sense, the government has a very specific power given to it by the Constitution that it in a sense, is allowed to objectify people based on their disadvantage, and it's allowed to give them special policy measures crafted to assist them and to ameliorate that disadvantage. What government has done is specifically disgusting in that it has passed the buck and it has said, no, private entities must discriminate just based on race because that's a proxy for disadvantage. I mean, it's so fucking disgusting. And so they don't have specific policies that actually ameliorate specific disadvantages so that you know when the policy has actually done its job. It just sort of just continues indefinitely. And if no progress is made, well, you just blame the system. It just never fucking ends, and the government never actually has any accountability for any of this stuff which it has promulgated essentially through the organs of the state, through the laws that should have been struck down, the laws that have not been deemed unconstitutional, and in a constitutional court which has effectively bought into this ideological racialist vision, which is so fucking antithetical to a non-racialist liberal democracy. So, we're pretty fucked. It is the slow motion train wreck. And if we don't even have the moral sense to get these things in order, conceptually, we have fucking no clue of actually reversing, the kind of where we're headed, which is already very much in motion. It's I mean, frankly, it's not likely that there's going to be a reversal. Frankly, we're going to sort of turn into an EFF Venezuela dictatorial thing. Oh, and that's another thing. This is another rhetoric thing. When you criticize the ANC, criticize the EFF first. Just call them the EFF elements within the ANC. Just to get the clarity of the thing that you are antithetical towards, and then describe how the ANC is not able to actually do any of the things that it's trying to do, or it won't be doing them effectively, because the EFF wing in the ANC controls policy and they're using it to continue their corruption machine, essentially. And that I think is the best way. I mean, one of the best ways to save the country would be if the public protector, which obviously this would be very strange, but I mean, because you would also need the constitutional court on your side, and they're pretty hopeless. You would perhaps need the public protector to set up a government of national unity, and you would make that government of national unity with Cyril Ramaphosa and Tito Mboweni, and most of the cabinet, and maybe even some DA people, and you would just say no, that these parties are not involved, so they're not actually, and they get that status from the public protector effectively, and because the personnel is somewhat the same, but they're unhinged then from the policy confines of the ANC, because but I mean, all that probably would be not politically tenable anyway. But just to try and get the 180-degree course correction, because we're sort of fighting time as well as the actual issues, and the issues are actually moving too slowly. The Kristallnacht is on its way, and the EFF are, they've already regimented, their little sort of army things, and they just need enough chaos. They don't even need to look credible. They just need to create enough chaos to burn, enough things down and incite enough, sort of just destabilizing I mean, it's the same thing as what Julius Malemo was doing when he was in the ANC in the Western Cape, trying to incite people to destroy, um, the toilets that were being installed. So what else? Yeah, so I mean, I just think the messages of stability, growth, and actually doing things that have a chance of creating the conditions for ameliorating the most disadvantaged people, and essentially growing the economy for the poor to be able to economically engage, and specifically also the idea that, you know, it's not even possible for government really to extend more security and more state services. Uh, it's just completely unsustainable. I mean, it could. I do actually think vouchers are the way to go with that. Um, I think that's a good way to inject the uh, liquidity into a thriving market, or into markets that are establishing themselves. You know, because if you can have a voucher system for housing and things like that, uh, you know, then you don't have these government contractors that are um, overpricing their services to the state. You've got people that are forging particular commercial, they're interfacing with commerce, at least through the voucher, and perhaps, with the voucher and some extra money because they want the house to be slightly different. It sort of it starts to promote access as opposed to just delivering something that is just kind of that's imposed by the state. It's much more fluid, it's much more organic, and it actually feels like liberation as opposed to this very different kind of paternalism, which is just expected to somewhat unsustainably find a way to scale itself always and sort of overshadow any kind of independent operating of the citizenry. I don't know. I mean, like maybe this is just because I watch too much YouTube, but I mean, maybe every now and again it wouldn't hurt to just have like a small thing about like just about some rich people. Like rich people. Uh, they don't have to be rich South Africans. They could perhaps go to another country. It's possible for us to abolish the rich if we so wish, but we've got 140 or 150,000 people in this country who are supplying what is it, 60% of the tax base, or something like that. And it's not as if, a rich person in business is not quite the same as a rich person who's politically connected. They actually, to get rich, other people have to buy things from them voluntarily. I don't know, like there might be something to sort of trying to sell some kind of libertarian, sort of ideas to sort of maybe just debunk some common things. I mean, it sounds perhaps a bit puerile, but I think you have to sort of make some even just simple formulations that yes, the EFF are going to stand up and say something, quite bigoted in fact, but then you actually you can engage in that rhetoric. It would be good to do so, to find ways of debunking their very convoluted and supposedly sophisticated, sort of interpretations of these things, in which you need a formulaic systemic objectification to counter their generalizable sort of boogeymen, or their generalized boogeymen. The only reason why rich people take their money out of the country is because I don't know if anyone's noticed, but this country doesn't really have a future. I mean, if you just look at ESCOM, if you just look at the debt, if you just look at the unsustainable, impractical policy that is getting more and more cannibalistic in this racialist orthodoxy, and this what can only be described as cultural fascism, really. And so many of these elements exist within the DA still. That's going to be a problem. I don't know how the DA is going to sort of actually cleanse itself, because although they're figureheads that believe in this, junk ideology, I think have all vacated. I mean, I don't know exactly the local politics stuff, but I mean, people who believe in identity consciousness, they are poisonous people. They're not. I mean, it really is worth getting rid of them. It really is worth ejecting them from the party. Whatever, even medium-term disruption it causes, it's not worth having them around. I mean, I don't know how much that is even possible, but I don't even know how people are capable of doing that. I mean, I guess at some point you have to have some kind of policy that says this is the party line, get with it, or you're not one of us. And that also remains to be seen if the DA can actually, if how much has the termite, gotten in. How much has this identity consciousness, how much has it been absorbed by the base of the party? Because I mean, this cuts across race, and it cuts across class. The people that have bought into this very disgusting vision of progress and how to categorize humanity. I mean, if that's what they believe, I mean, it really would be better if they just went to the EFF, or they went to the ANC, or I guess they create some, I guess what in British politics, which they call themselves Liberal Democrats, I think. Actually, I'm not actually sure if the Liberal. I haven't. I mean, they are pro EU, which to me just means that they're pro big business. They just want big regulation. They don't want again, like I would say, the DA should be the party of incubating small and medium business. That's how it needs to position itself, and it can do so by saying, in most industries we need regulation to be streamlined and understandable and readable by the business owners themselves and the people who are managing the business. And if it's not a very technical business, it should be accessible, essentially. And that licenses should generally have nominal fees attached to them. I mean, perhaps if the same person asks to be licensed many, many times, at some point they should start being charged if they keep on failing the licensing process, which is essentially being provided by the states. But essentially there should be very few, not very few, but obstacles to entry in industry should be as small as possible, essentially. That should be, and if the DA is the party of incubating small and medium businesses, which is, I mean, that is the most prime thing for a developing country. This is a developing country. We need to think of what this country looks like for someone wanting to start a small business. And focusing on systemic oppression and identity consciousness, or identity politics, whatever you want to call it. I mean, essentially, all it does is it incentivizes people to go study useless subjects at universities so that they can continue to complain about those very things and not be skilled and not be capable of starting a business. And it's a very strange, vicious, self-fulfilling prophecy that needs to be unlocked from. It needs to be disengaged. And we need to stop avoiding the task of developing this country and not doing it from the top down and not doing it via government mandate. Government needs to actually get out of the way and stop sabotaging the economy. It's not that hard. It's so incapable of even managing its own state-owned enterprises, and now it wants to regulate the economy as well. Well, it's done just as well. Look at what the government has done to Eskom. It has done the exact same thing to the economy. And then it has blamed private business, and private business has not been able to speak up about it because the rule of law has been so destroyed that licenses will not be given to businesses that speak out against the corruption. So we've got moral corruption, a myriad of moral corruption, and we've got this proliferation of this toxic identity consciousness, which is promoted by this very toxic regulation, which destroys networking, destroys authentic development, it destroys investing in people, it creates perverse incentives, it makes small businesses avoid black candidates. And in fact, all the good black candidates leave this country as soon as they can, because why would they stay in a place in which they're going to be treated like a token because of the government? They're going to be treated as part of a quota. The idea that people would not be able to treat each other with compassion and humanity if the government didn't mandate it, and because there aren't enough larger mandates and stronger mandates and more stringent mandates, that's why things are failing, and business has to keep up with this and actually try to expand or something like that. It's shrunk instead. The economy has shrunk. In a developing country, the economy has shrunk. Look at all of our... they say that the region of this country, the sub-Saharan Africa, grew by 3%. But you have to contrast that with South Africa, which is probably one of the largest components in sub-Saharan Africa, and we had a negative growth rate essentially. So if you it would be very interesting to see what is the growth rate in sub-Saharan Africa with South Africa removed. It's probably closer to 6%, or I mean, if you're just looking at GDP because of how much GDP we take up in terms of the proportion of sub-Saharan Africa, it must be close, it must be at least 6%, perhaps even higher. So actually our regional growth rate, excluding us, is probably north of 6%. I mean, it's disgusting, and we have a negative growth rate, essentially. And still they want to complain about white monopoly capital. Because it suits their identity consciousness. I mean, people need to take this perspective to task. They need to call it out, so at least there is a credible alternative in the voting booth, that there's an alternative vision and an alternative voice to this bullshit. Because if there isn't an alternative, well, I mean, I will at least be upset that, the history of this country was spectacularly let down, as no one decided to champion the Constitution. No one decided to assert the I mean, there should at least be a political faction that is willing to lay out the travesties and the destruction being wrought, and holding the people to account as well for essentially endorsing those disgusting views. I don't care how tentatively, in our opinion, those views are disgusting. With all decorum and etiquette that might be necessary. But, at some point, if we get to that point, at some point we will have to look back at the history, at this part of our history, if we manage to get through this course. And say, well, how do we actually deal with fascist parties in parliament? How do we deal with the EFF and racialist, demagogues? How do we deal with a rogue constitutional court? I mean, that's if that is going to be resolved, I don't even know how this. I mean, so what you'd have to approach the court and you'd have to say, look, I'm sorry. But essentially our case is that we hold you in contempt of what your court should be, but what it isn't. So I guess technically we are in contempt of court bringing this application. But you people are, you've betrayed the Constitution, and it's disgusting. And really, we're willing to revolt against you. And we have no allegiance to you. And if you don't fix your opinions, and you don't fix your judgments, and you don't change, if you don't make a declaratory order, sort of revising some of these points and getting them in line with the Constitution, I don't, it's like, well, I'm sorry that sounds so strange, that it's a very strange legal argument. What can you even do with that? But I mean, that's really the position. You're going to have to approach the court. I mean, one should at least approach the court first before doing anything more radical, perhaps. But it's you should at least also approach the court with some ostensible supplication, just to try to keep the to maintain sort of some semblance of the functionality of the framework, in some sense, in terms of what it should be, the kind of it's interesting because you know when you look at the EFF is always standing up for institutional power in this way because they are legal positivists, which is also the kind of the legal positivism is the legal theory that the Constitutional Court is already on the side of. So you know they're already primed to go full fascist. You know they're already primed to say, well, you know, as long as government has the right aim in mind, we can define anything to be consistent with the Constitution as long as you've made the right promises about what this policy is said to accomplish. And so, you know, in that sense, they have really given over their discerning, their judging function, the judicial function. They have essentially handed it over to the plenary power in some sense. So they don't have discretion anymore. Their discretion is the sort of the policy intention of the plenary. It's I mean that is fascism. That's just that is exactly how the fascist culture works. And essentially it's facilitated by this cultural orthodoxy, which everyone believes in the same level of objectification. Everyone has the same filter of reality. And so because people believe that race is a proxy for disadvantage, everyone is just forced to sing along in that chorus. They are forced to enter the groupthink, and if they don't, they are branded racist or that they are promoting hate speech. You know, this is the formula effectively. And so because they have the self-righteous aims in mind, because they are motivated by their righteousness, if you speak against them, then you know you're practicing hate speech, because also you haven't joined them, so you must be hateful. And so, you know, they create this very strange kind of collective idol, this collectivist idolatry in some sense, that they've got this collective understanding of epistemology and knowledge that, you know, that the identity answers those questions, that the racialist notion answers these questions, the racialist matrix that they have imposed on us already now. I mean, this is basically, this is how they interpret the law already. So, actually, I mean, I'm talking off the cuff, so let me just go to some of my notes, because they're going to be disjointed, but I did deal with this. Oh, no, wait. No, it wasn't in my notes. It was in a past recording. Damn it. Yeah, it was a recording that I didn't upload because it was sort of... It's just a whole lot of rough notes, and it was something like the intellectual themes. I don't know what to do with all my rough notes. I might just make like a very long video, but you know, that's just for... I mean, I'm not, you know, I don't expect that people are actually listening to this stuff. But it makes me feel better about at least having something down for posterity.